Our next panel is entitled, How Data Will Drive LifeCare. Our moderators are Harel, Kodesh, Operating Partner, Silver Lake, former Vice President of Predix, and former Chief Technology Officer of GE Digital. And co-moderator, Dr. Mike Kellen, Chief Technology Officer, Sage Bionetworks. And they are joined by panelists, Dr. Jack Poe, Product Manager, Google, Jack Walker, co-founder and president of Sports Innovation Lab, and Dr. Cyrus Shahabi, chair, Department of Computer Science, the University of Southern California Viterbi School of Engineering. And finally, Sean Vassilaros, chief operating officer, Thread Research. Let's welcome them.
Well, it looks like we lost the government here, so we can have real fun and ask some nasty questions. Right, so what I would like to do in this session is actually take a little bit, we talked about regulation, we talked about the application of data. What we would like to do is actually follow the data from the moment it is generated by the sensors through the system that it getting aggregated into, analyzed, and then maybe ask a question or two about the ethical usage of data that at one level can help humanity to get to a better stage, but at the same time is fraught with issues regarding privacy, ethics, and who's supposed to get the data and what rights and privileges and obligation they have once they get their hands on that. So Mike and I are going to moderate the panel. If we can just go through the participants and they can tell us a little bit about themselves, I think it will put us on ground zero.
Hi, I'm Mike Kellen. I'm with Sage Bionetworks, which is a nonprofit research organization located up in Seattle. So we're coming at this space from a little different angle than most of the people in the room. I don't have any extreme sports or military heroics to talk about. But our focus is really on coming in from more of a basic science angle and trying to understand the biology of human diseases better as a starting point, and that's taken us progressively a little bit more towards healthcare and delivery because we see these things converging to a little bit. As we move towards more and more digital data and larger scale systems for managing patient information, there's tremendous value in being able to extract information from those systems and use them to not just immediately affect care delivery, but longer term to actually better understand human disease and biology a little bit better as well. So really excited to be here with the other panelists and meet you all in the setting. Jack.
Great. My name is Jack Poe. I work at Google, which incidentally celebrated its 20th anniversary yesterday. So if you go to google.com, there's a nice video that talks about sort of the evolution of Google going from a search company to really adding mobile, adding AI, and adding a lot of things since then. We have been working in the healthcare space almost for a decade now in different capacities. Around anywhere from 5 to 10% of the search queries at Google are health-related. So we basically have been returning search results to folks looking for health data for a long time. I specifically work on areas where we're trying to apply the different machine learning techniques that the rest of the company and actually, frankly, the rest of the world has been innovating in the last 10 to 20 years and see how we could apply some of that into healthcare. We've been publishing quite a bit of work recently in the medical journals talking about how you can actually apply some of the same techniques we use on things like YouTube to do image recognition in the medical space or to do things like voice recognition or to pick up biomarkers from voice and see if we can use those features in healthcare. And we're very excited about the potential of having large data sets and artificial intelligence in areas such as healthcare.
Thanks. So I'll try not to be too intimidated by the fact that I'm sandwiched between all these PhDs. My name's Josh Walker. You guys met my co-founder and CEO Angela Ruggiero this morning. We are really trying to figure out where the intersection of sports and technology abut and influence adjacent markets like digital healthcare. So it is my job to be more of the data guy, the software guy in the partnership and the development of our business. And my background started way back in 1997 when the internet was exploding in a good way. I was an analyst at Forrester Research looking at all the first generation digital health companies, e-commerce companies, personalization companies, really followed the evolution of the internet as it made its way from text-based browsers to image-based browsers to video players, and now into the world where we're looking at sensor data that's going to create a new interface for the human body. So we spend a lot of time, Dr. Leslie Saxon is one of our advisors, really thinking about what that human browser is and how we can get a view into the body and what that means for the sports industry, what that means for youth sports, what that means for the development of humanity in general. Big idea. So.
Hi, I'm Cyrus Shahabi. I'm with the computer science department. As computer scientists, I guess we cannot talk unless there's a PowerPoint slide. So I have some slides prepared. I'm not sure if I can see them, but I can tell you a little bit. So my background is data management and data analysis. So we get excited when we have challenging data sets. In the past, I was working with data from transportation applications. So we really want to work with data sets that have real-world applications with societal impacts. And with transportation, we, in particular, we're looking at about 15,000 sensors around LA County that were sending data to us every 30 seconds and trying to analyze that data for various reasons, for example, for policy in transportation, whether this carpool lane, for example, should be changed into a HOT lane so you pay, or, for example, for urban planning, whether they need to restructure certain areas because of traffic. So recently, the past couple of years, actually, we realized there are similar challenges with wearable data sets. And because they are also streamed, and you want to deal with the noisy data and so on. And the application that we focused on was, of course, the health application. So I have some set of obstacles and challenges to dealing with wearable data when it comes to health applications. And mainly the problem is that although the data is there, the data is collected in clinics from patients are much more reliable data that has been shown that you can actually make actionable decisions. However, for wearable data, that has not been proven yet. And mainly that's because the clinician, they cannot immediately use this data set as they are. So we started looking at building a toolkit to help the clinicians to quickly work with this data set. And in order to do so, we look at some of the main challenges. One of them is that when you go, for example, to a clinic and you collect your ECG data, there's an expert there. They place the leads exactly where they're supposed to be. They have you, for example, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If things go wrong, they do it again. So everything is very well in a very kind of a controlled environment with an expert in the room. However, with wearable data, the advantage is that you get the data across the, for example, whole day or week, so it's more data, but unfortunately, the data is noisy, for example. There is no expert to redo things, so you get whatever you get, and you need to deal with that data set. So we look at some of these challenges, the challenges of noisy and irregular data, the fact that you collect data from whoever provides the data, so it's a multiple cohorts, and the fact that data is coming at you at the streaming mode. And then decided to build a toolkit, so deal with these, but at the same time preserve the privacy and confidentiality of the data, has an easy, friendly access to for the clinicians to use it, and then extend it to other devices. And the main underlying approach was basically the deep learning techniques, if you're familiar, that we use there. And then most importantly, we realized working with real-world application, the only way to make an impact is to work with the experts in the area. So we work with 3 different experts for 3 different types of application, including Dr. Saxon for ECG data. in order to build this toolkit. So that's, I guess, why I'm here in this panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Vassilaros. I'm with Thread Research. We are a software platform that enables remote patient research. You saw some of our application today in the Connected Marine Study. We assisted in gathering that data and connecting the participant with the device and making sure that data was provided in a readable format so that Dr. Saxon and her colleagues could start putting together conclusions. We heavily believe that research and wearable data is still in its infancy. However, some very strong progress has been made in the last little bit with wearable devices and normalizing that data. But we also believe that there's a fine balance between getting the accurate data from a clinic visit and the convenience and the burden that it puts on participants and patients in the research and the clinical space. And so our mission really is to help connect participants and patients to research studies so that they can participate anywhere. We can get rid of bias and geography as a limitation for research. We can collect additional contextual data, and we can drive down the cost of these studies, ultimately adding to a better textbook for AI and machine learning to be able to ultimately provide better care. So that's kind of been our role, and our mission is to help that patient experience and take the burden off of participants, patients, and clinicians in the research space.
All right. Before we start, I realized that I didn't introduce myself. I thought it was so obvious. My name is Harel Kodesh. I'm a partner at Silver Lake. Silver Lake is a private equity firm that started back in '98 the idea of investing in technology and technology-enabled companies. And today we have about $35 billion under management. And through some of our investments, we got much better familiarity with healthcare companies, all the way from senior living and assistance to pharmaceutical demand and optimization. And the more we invest, the more we realize that this is pretty much a bottomless pit in terms of what you can find, fix, and build value. Before that, I ran software for GE. And don't blame me for everything that is happening to GE these days. I didn't build the turbines, but we worked a lot with GE Healthcare, and we also found some super exciting areas where we can improve really the quality of life for both normal citizens as well as the outliers, athletes, military, etc. So, Dr. Shahabi, you mentioned that wearables are in the beginning of their way. It's not exactly where we are, where we would like them to be. In your vision, when you take us 5 years from now or 10 years from now, do you believe that wearables or any body networks kind of devices will be able to give us more than just the ECG and the heart rate that we're getting today, or is it pretty much what we're going to see in the foreseeable future?
So what, from like my perspective, and I said they're not ready, I was not in particular referring to the sensors. I was more talking about the data that's collected. It's not at the quality that you expect in particular, if you have a serious healthcare application. From a sensor perspective, I mean, that's not my expertise, but what I'm seeing actually happening, there are more and more sensors being developed. So it's definitely going beyond heart rate and ECG. I mean, there are already sensors that can actually collect small blood samples for sugar, for example, and there are also a lot of other type of sensors that are not directly collecting data from the human body, but they are collecting relevant data such as pollution, for example, and various gases in the area. So definitely the advances are there, but just having the sensors and collecting data doesn't necessarily mean that the data is available for non-expert like non-computer science experts to immediately use that and get reasonable quality data that they need for the applications.
Okay. Dr. Poe, from Google perspective, when you look at the industry in general, as opposed to what the government or not-for-profit organizations are doing, do you see the proliferation of the sensor as a necessary condition to improve the state of digital health? Or is it something that once the data is absorbed or is accumulated in the data centers, this is where the work starts?
Well, I think you need to have sensors in order to have any types of data at all. Speaking for as a physician who's been very interested in digital healthcare for a long time, I think in many cases we are at the very early stages, as was mentioned, for the clinical community to really start leveraging this data. Right now, there's a lot of biomarkers that we use traditionally in medicine, whether it's a 10 to 30 second EKG, a blood pressure measurements that we take specifically at clinic. And the reason why those measurements are really important are because we have decades and decades of research that happen to get done on top of those biomarkers. Those biomarkers in many ways are actually all surrogates for what we really care about in medicine. So I see these new types of sensors as collecting data that are essentially new biomarkers. In many cases, I would actually say they are potentially much more accurate, because instead of collecting a data point every 0.01% of a person's life, some of these sensors are now collecting data points for the entire 24-hour period. And we're now getting to a point where there are, with advocacy of many folks, including folks like, of course, Dr. Saxon, starting to do these studies so that you can now have risk stratification. You can have treatment guidelines that could potentially be built on top of these types of sensor data. And I think that's very exciting for us. And of course, Apple has been doing incredible work in really building sensors, as well as showing, I think, examples of how some of this data should be used that are really helping to push the field forward. And we are also building a lot of those features on top of the Android platform. And startups, I think, are playing an incredible role in really sorting out some of those signals, whether it's new signals, new sensors, but then also doing the clinical validation on top of that and really getting the community lots and lots of different indications and lots of different possibilities where some of these things can advance.
Yeah, if I could build on that, like one of the big challenges that we see from a research standpoint is there may be lots of new data streams coming in from new sensors, and the frequency of that data is much higher than we've ever had before. But one of the big things that's holding back is not ability to manage and process and deal with the size and complexity of the data coming in. It's if you don't have outcomes that are meaningful tied to all this new sensor data, it's really hard to make use of it, right? In any sort of machine learning problem, you need to measure the thing that you ultimately want to train the machine to predict. And if the thing you're trying to affect is the health of somebody with a chronic disease, then you have to actually figure out, how do I measure and quantify the health of somebody with Parkinson's disease, and how do I know whether or not that person is getting sicker or better? And if your sensor data is coming in on a daily basis, but your gold standard is, what does the physician say when this person walks in the office once every 6 months? There's kind of a inherent limitation to how well any sort of machine learning approach can take. And I'm going to Jack or Cyrus, if
well, I think when we're on these panels, a lot of times we get focused on the sensors, we get focused on the data. I think this is a skills issue, and it's not talked about enough. The idea that you have somebody who understands what they're looking for from an outcome perspective, or has the medical background to manage, manipulate, organize, and analyze this data is incredibly rare. You run a startup, and we do, in Boston, where we're in MIT and Harvard's backyard, and we have access to partners like USC and others. And you can't find data scientists, data engineers that understand the problems they're working on. They understand the data, If you say, hey, we've got this many terabytes of data and we need you to run a Hadoop cluster that does X, Y, Z, they can do that. They know how to do that, but it's a very rare skill set. And I think universities have to take this on as a charter to create that cross-disciplinary skill that allows them to work on these problems as the sensors are putting out more of this information. It's not the sensors. The sensors are getting better. They're getting cheaper. It's not that the data can't be organized and streamed into massive databases that can run jobs all the time. It's the people that have to actually understand what they're working with.
So if I mean,
That's a little bit of my soapbox, but
since you brought it up, I put my chair hat. Actually, at the computer science department, we're starting new joint degrees with various other schools in order to teach data science, not just to computer science background students, but also to students with other types of background. And we just recently actually started one with the with our medical school in the healthcare data science, and that's really the goal, to have this kind of a hybrid. Students where they do understand the data science at the same time they have the domain expertise as well.
So,
We're looking for interns.
I'll give you my business card.
Sounds great.
I have a question for you, Sean. And when you look at, let's say, if you're trying to develop a new traffic navigation app, there are quite a few databases and regular databases that you can get from from Department of Transportation, from cellular carriers that will allow you to actually jump in and start using the data to build your app. If you think about building a digital health app, are you running into issues with where to get the data? Is the data proprietary, or do you see today general purpose databases or repositories like the ones that Mike is working on that you can be made available for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we find that there's multiple sources of data and data collection. Obviously, there's collection from the participant or the patient, and that's objective and subjective, right? Because you also have the device data. But and I'm only going to speak about research because that's kind of our forte. Where it gets really interesting is when you're able to start layering publicly available health data on top of subjective and objective collected participant data and come up with conclusions. So, for example, I could be a pharmaceutical company trying to put together a trial on a blood clot medicine, and we're finding that they're getting adverse events on a regular basis, this particular demographic. Well, if I just have that one data point to look at, then I would say, hey, my drug is failing. I'm going to have to do some sort of effort here to resolve that. However, if you are able to layer contextual data on top of that one data point of that adverse event, and you can see that they live in an area with very poor air quality, that they are taking their medication with cake and a Guinness, and that who knows that it's freezing outside and they don't own a coat, right? So think about the difference in care that you can give with context. And so ultimately, our goal is to help gather all points of data, that whether it's entered by the patient, whether it's entered by the clinician, or whether it's publicly available, so that we can give anyone who's coming up with conclusions and making decisions a solid set of information to make true contextual conclusions.
Yeah. So I'll say one thing, and I'll caveat by saying that I'm by no means speaking for the government, but so large tech companies, and me included, are involved in efforts in the ONC, at the NIH, at the National Library of Medicine, where one of the things we've been trying to deal with is on interoperability as well as the availability of data sets, as you were mentioning. I think one of the things that I frequently see is that clinicians are more than willing to validate something. I think every clinician at the top of their mind is what will make my patients better. So validation is almost never the issue. The issue is in some of the things that you were mentioning, which is, for atmospheric predictions, we have large NOAA data sets. For traffic, we have large data sets. In healthcare, there is starting to be a push amongst not just from the tech companies, but actually hospitals themselves recognizing that the data that they sit on is very valuable, and there are many of you have probably read about what's happening in Sloan Kettering and other places, a lot of ethical discussions. I think it was alluded in the last panel about how to treat some of that data, but there's a general recognition that there's a need to make this data not just available, but with context as well as in standards. And many of us who are involved in digital health are also involved in those other standard setting committees, in those efforts, trying to get whether it's radiology, x-rays data is available, accelerometer data available, et cetera, so that the field can be opened up generally, as opposed to just having a few tech companies who just happen to have amassed a lot of data.
So let me ask you a follow-up question about that, because that's actually a topic that Dr. Sexer and I discussed yesterday. If you think about as you said, the transportation, traffic data, atmospheric data, you have actually, either you have a designated organization like NOAA has taken upon itself to actually publish the data, and because they're a government agency, they're not trying to monetize that. And then you have maybe other folks like the cellular carriers that are willing to publish the data in return for some level of compensation. When you look at the data, the medical data historically, it is guarded not just for HIPAA reasons, but also for ownership reasons. It's guarded pretty aggressively by either the hospital or the MRI clinic that is creating the images, or sometimes by the patient themselves. Do you see a need, or do you see a reality where those data sets are going to be available to every practitioner that would like to do that, fully anonymized and standardized and cleaned up and normalized? And is it something that you believe the government should do, the university, like the Center for Body Computing should do, or is it something that really between Google, Apple, and Microsoft, there should be some level of alliance that will keep the data in their data centers, but expose it to other people?
So I would love to hear the opinions of other panelists as well. I think it actually, even in atmospheric data, you have multiple stakeholders who are all contributing to this effort. I think in healthcare, we actually have been collecting and curating data for a very long time. So if you look at, for example, what Truven, which is now part of what IBM Watson does, claims data is actually pretty well standardized. There are standard formats, and actually these data sets are available generally to researchers, for-profits, nonprofits, et cetera. I think we are getting to a place where we are starting to meet standards so that different hospitals who have the same data can at least share it. Without going through enormous amount of work, which I think Apple has done tremendous amount of work in the Fire space, as well as in their recent tools where they're now clearly exposing that data to patients. I think patients now are clearly a big stakeholder in this. We have hospitals that are pushing for Fire as part of government incentive programs, whether it's meaningful use-free, or in the case where it was mentioned earlier, CMS is now actually imposing specific regulations as well as Medicare penalties for folks who are not sharing data. And I think, of course, the companies themselves have to recognize that an open platform is sometimes better than a closed one, so that they can even work amongst each other as opposed to each of them working in silos. And I think healthcare, we're starting to get that push from multiple stakeholders. To be fair, I think there's a ton of work to be done for very basic things like insurance eligibility. We still don't have one place to check. But we are starting to have a lot of pressure from multiple places. I think for the physicians and the innovators and the patients in conferences such as this, we have a lot of power to actually make our opinions known and make our desires known and really push for a lot of this so that this can happen on a much wider scale. I know for wearables data, we really, we're just starting to deal with basic things like diagnosis codes. We're nowhere close to dealing with wearable data, but I think there is an understanding that it needs to happen, although probably not on any major roadmap for a while.
And I think if you look at the way that the internet is developed, there's a mistake to be made to think that if you hold the database, you should charge people access on the API level to get 10,000 records, 10,000 records, 10,000 records. That the real value and the economic benefit is in the derivative data. When you're actually merging unstructured data with device data, with sort of imaging data, and that the people that can do that effectively are going to be the ones that make the most out of what's available, so that there's an incentive almost for the ones that have those siloed databases, those siloed data structures, those siloed formats, to make that available to others who can actually manipulate it. And if they start to allow that to happen, then there's more of an understanding of how continuing to feed that pipeline will benefit them economically in the future, I think.
So one idea actually that, we were kind of working in the area of IoT, Internet of Things, and might be applicable here for at least wearable data, is to have some sort of a data market, a marketplace where the sellers are basically the patients that's selling the data, and the buyers can be the clinicians or whoever who want to get access to the data. And for certain cases, the patient might provide the data for free or at different granularities or at different resolution, depending on who's the buyer. And then in this marketplace, we can also have data brokers, where they take the data, they add value, and they put it back in the market. And that marketplace basically would take government companies and so on out of the equation, in the sense that nobody really controls it except for the patients and depending on who would provide value back to the patient. So that's one idea. I don't know if it's going to work, but we are trying it in other areas right now.
Sean, any point of view on that?
No, I really like the idea of a collective. I mean, ultimately, we all have the same goal, and that's to kind of make the world healthier, right? And everything that we do is steps in that direction. And so I look around the room, and the people that I know and the organizations that they represent, that really is, if you get rid of everything else, that's their goal. And so would love to see that concept of a collaborative effort to allow that data to be released and allow anyone who wants to come and find that and make conclusions and help push the better healthcare movement forward, I think would be a great thing.
And I don't even know how collaborative it has to be. I mean, you all use Kayak as a travel website. I mean, the airlines and the hotels and the car rental companies don't love them, but they competed above all the other information and added a superior service, and they're winning in that industry because of that. So I think that's more the model that I'm talking about than it is like everybody getting together and saying kumbaya. It's about, that like, there's somebody has to create derivative value and go direct to the consumers.
So I want to jump in here with a couple observations. One is, we have a model in the social networking space of one company owning vast amounts of data and selling API access to it, and they've been in some ways very successful at it. But if you look at the news today, Facebook just had another data breach affecting 50 million accounts, and that's, based pictures of my kids and stuff like that. We're talking about medical systems where the data is, first of all, in many cases, inherently not completely de-identifiable. It's, there's going to be things like genomics, things come in from sensors, if there's GPS, things are in these data sets that make it impossible to completely de-identify people without destroying the value of the data, right? So we can't say, well, the data is going to be de-identified and it'll be safe. That's not going to happen. And so if you have, the notion of a single for-profit company aggregating that data and selling assets creates risks to the individuals, and you say, well, people can opt into that. Well, if you put your data in that system, it's not just your health data, it's actually your relative's health data as well. Just as your data in Facebook is not just your data, it's your relative's data, whether you like it or not. Even if you've never opened a Facebook account, I guarantee you Facebook knows who everybody in this room is, and right, because you're all connected to enough people that have posted pictures of you, or that's in their database. So, I think health is one of those areas where we have to seriously think about the space. And I'm not somebody who's anti corporations or saying that there's no role there, but this is a space where I think there's a pretty good case to be made for public-private partnerships and creative ways to address the space to mitigate these risks. Because, right, I mean, nobody knew what the risks of putting data into Facebook were 10 years ago. It just seemed like a novelty. And it's impossible at this state to say what are the downstream risks 10 years from now of putting data into some of these large-scale systems. What is that going to do to your grandchildren's ability to get health insurance 20 years from now? Like, that's not an answerable question right now, and that has to be considered.
Well, I would say that I think one of the things that we should probably recognize is that many of the questions that we're discussing are actually not new at all, right? So there are many examples of new biomarkers in medicine. There are many examples of all of these ethical quandaries. When we started just basically doing, physician gut instinct biomarkers to running large clinical trials, running multi-center clinical trials, where do we store this data to the point where FDA is now saying you have to publish positive and negative trials, you have to publish your data sets. I think a lot of these problems are things that have been tackled by medicine over the course of 100, 150 years, and there are precedents set up already. And I think digital health is getting to that place where, yes, the problems are slightly different, but there are lots and lots of smart people, lots and lots of very responsible and folks who are all trying to get to the right place, who are thinking about it. I don't have good solutions for any of the things that I think folks are bringing up, but I think it's really important to recognize that as long as everyone generally agree about, that this is in fact a helpful thing to do, we would all like to somehow improve patient lives and that there is power here, I think we can have very reasonable debates and regulation around governments, around industry, around patient advocacy groups, all who are trying to target these signals and trying to get to a better place.
So I agree with Dr. Poe that these are issues we've been talking about as an industry for a long time, but what's not true is the fact that consumers' expectations around privacy are changing. So when we start a conversation with many of our clients, we start with like all these crazy things that we didn't think would ever happen are happening now, right? We go through slide after slide of like, hey, did you think you could jump on a scooter and just drop it in the middle of the sidewalk and everybody would be cool with that? And like all these different things that we're starting to see for the first time is really happening at a different level. And it's not just a millennial thing, everybody likes to say, oh, millennials are changing. It's like everybody is like very willing to give up more in exchange for something. And that is definitely generational. I'm very different than the decade before me. And there's plenty of research that shows that continues to happen.
So I managed to get a respectable 20% of the question I was going to ask. I see we have time for one more question. It's really, at the big scheme of things, if you look at Uber, they did not try to build a disparate system for cab companies. If you look at Amazon, they didn't settle for, selling books on the internet. If you look at Facebook, they didn't build messengers. They built something completely different. So there is a fundamental decision between building, at least on the strategic level, building an evolutionary system that will make the hospital, the clinics a little bit better, a little bit faster over time. Or as one of the high-tech companies told me a couple of years ago, it's time to just buy a hospital, kick out all the doctors, all the patients, digitize it, and bring everybody back in on different terms. I just want to get a reading from you folks. Where do you see us, in the spectrum? Do you think that digital health can become a commonplace in an evolutionary way, or do we need to hit a reset button on some of the practices?
I feel like we should start on that end.
Yeah, hey, I'll jump in on that. So a great question and a very loaded question. I will tell you this, in our history of working and trying to innovate within healthcare, being a pioneer in healthcare is incredibly difficult. But we have had the opportunity to take a seat, stand behind some glass, watch some participants interact with the technology that's going to change their approach to medicine. And I'll tell you this, people are ready for it. They are not just ready, they're embracing it. And I think that as we continue to innovate and take the burden off of them for their healthcare and their treatments, and also research, that we're going to find that general populations are going to absolutely embrace it. So,
okay. Any other opinions?
As an academician, I guess no.
Yeah, so I mean, as an optimist, I look at the quality of the people in this room. I look at the quality of the hospitals in Boston, where we're from. We have hackathons with Children's Hospital in Boston, and phenomenal MIT engineers come out, and the Harvard engineers come out. There's just people that just refuse to accept that this is the way things are going to continue. So I am an optimist. I understand the definition of optimism better today, but it's we'll deal with the tools we have, and if our knee hurts, we'll fix healthcare. So.
It's amazing.
Jack, what do you think?
I think digital medicine is something that is coming, but I don't think it is something that physicians are fighting against necessarily. I think most folks in healthcare recognizes that increasingly care is going to be delivered outside of brick walls. So I think it's actually a time when the healthcare delivery folks are starting to reach out, and I think it will not be, I think the results will be revolutionary in 10 years, but I don't think it's the type of thing where, some innovator is going to come in and tomorrow there'll be no hospitals.
Mike, any point
Yeah,
of view?
I mean, I have to strap a little bit from like the clinical research space into the healthcare space, but my intuition is that things have to evolve incrementally, even what like that may turn into a complete change over the course of time, but you can't have this intermediate state where you shut down healthcare delivery to rebuild and then like reopen the doors. Like you can't ever turn it off. And like we see this in the clinical trial space. Like our original approach to working folks like Apple on ResearchKit was to say, can we run a clinical trial without ever physically seeing a patient? Right? We're gonna put the app in the App Store. People will download it, and we'll run a clinical study that way. And that taught us a lot, but I think part of what it taught us was that the best applications for these new digital technologies were adjuncts to existing trial structures, not as complete replacements. And so in now the second wave of studies that we're, second and third wave of studies now that we're in, it's not, oh my God, this digital technology is going to replace the way that we did research before, and it's going to be completely new and better now, and right, it's more like it now it's, here's a new channel of data. We're still going to run the trial the old way. We're still, and that's real. That hybrid state has to exist for a while because you have to overlap the traditional system with the new digital approaches long enough to build the confidence that the digital approaches are really working. And then my sense, like eventually the old practices will drop out, but it could take a while.
Okay.
So now we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers from everybody in the room. Questions? Please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you.
Kaiser Permanente, the approximate time somebody like an internist has to see a patient with 5 to 10 major medical problems is decreasing. And the complexity of disease is getting worse and worse. And the amount of information a doctor is asked to process on any one patient is massively increasing. I've had this theory that we should be walking into clinics, putting our finger in, literally digitalizing the intake, or we're never going to get good health care because no human being could process this much information this efficiently. How close are we? Let's take Kaiser because it's a big HMO. What's the chances of stepping into a clinic, being analyzed bluntly, getting a computer readout and walking to your doctor with the readout rather than the other way around?
Didn't Watson do this? I mean, I'm not being facetious. I think Watson and IBM did this on a 60 Minutes to see how close they were to an actual doctor's diagnosis. So if I'm... Yeah, so I think this is in my estimation, because I've tried to do a bunch of research in this space to validate which products and services are out there in the marketplace, is that this was the most comprehensive attempt to try to mimic what you're talking about. So I think we're pretty far away. They were very impressed with the machine learning and the algorithms and the way that they were able to take a subset of data and derive certain, diagnoses from that stuff. But I'm pretty sure that is on the web, and it's definitely worth looking at if you're curious. I don't mean to dismiss your question, but I think that of all the things I've looked at, that's the thing that got closest to replicating an answer to your question.
I would like to offer a little bit of an opposing opinion. I think we're very far away from that. I mean, I have a lot of respect for IBM, but Watson is a system that was based on NLP and its basically beginning and the ability to build machine learning algorithm to deal with variety or variance of human blood sample, protein samples, etc., is much higher, greater complexity than what Watson has. The idea is not bad, but even then, Watson deals with the information once it's in the database, not necessarily with the intake problem. So you have the double complexity of multiple stages, and also the industry does need to create more machine learning algorithms that are different. They're much more long time series. They're not necessarily NLP based. So we have a lot of work to do, but at least we know where we want to get. And I think that the vision that you outlined is really the guiding principle, but it's going to take a while.
So I would say a slight caveat to that, which is I think really depends on what you mean by sensors, right? So Kaiser is actually a very good example where in the last 2 or 3 years, actually, their telemedicine volume has started to cut into their primary care volume. And the primary care volume has been cutting into their specialist care volume for a very long time now. So if we're talking about like a full-blown diagnosis, I think we're very far away.
Yeah, what's the definition of telemedicine? Like video-based or?
So many of them are actually phone-based, primarily because a lot of the visits that physicians actually do have nothing to do with like really making a brand new diagnosis, right? We deal with a lot of chronic care patients. We deal with a lot of, and I'll sort of rat myself out. So as Dr. Saxon knows, I have a newborn, and having gone through medical school means I freak out about everything. So I call my pediatrician with really stupid questions, right? Like, I can show up, and which sometimes I do, and say like, is she okay? Like, she stopped drinking milk. But like those questions, you don't really need all that fancy of a sensor or frankly, all that fancy of a diagnosis, right? Like the physician are increasingly able to just do that over the telephone, the video, maybe with 1 or 2 very trivial sensors. And that actually accounts for a surprisingly large volume of physician visits. So we are going to go to a place, because every health institution realizes they're losing money on these visits, where these visits are in fact going to get cut down one way or another. Where does sensors really start to play a role? I don't think anyone really knows, but it's definitely coming one way or another.
My question, we have the data, which I think is fantastic. How do we get the patient population to use the data to produce real results?
Yeah, so this is something we deal with a lot because we're trying to measure people's responsiveness to something during the course of a long-term degenerative diseases. And, in the context of Parkinson's or cancer, some of the areas we work in, it can be really challenging, right? Because I've been surprised in how many things from earlier today translate, but one of the big differences is we're dealing with a lot of patient populations where things are inherently only ever going to get worse. And so figuring out how to message people and engage them in care delivery and in participation in trials and providing more data about themselves when the reality is like there is no treatment for something like Parkinson's disease, that there's no treatment for the underlying cause of the disease. There are medications that pull back the system, so it's very tricky. And what we found by talking to a lot of patients ties into some of the other things around framing and trying to put out positive goals and things for people to work for. And the trick is that like it has to be achievable, something that is positive and going in a direction, but is not unrealistic for the person. Because if it goes too far in the unrealistic thing, they will inevitably drop out down the road. So it's really hard.
So now we have time for one more question.
That would be me. Good.
Comment. Hello? So I think one of the issues that was that somebody was asking about with the adoption of some of these technologies, I think the payment issue is our pediatrician over there was asking, I think, the question. I think payment is a huge part of this. I've worked at Kaiser, and I am shocked at my shift, having left Kaiser, how much more inefficient I am. I mean, it's painful. On the other hand, one of the reasons Kaiser can do part of what it does is that they are the insurer. It's all a bucket within themselves. Do you have any thoughts on the payment side of all of this to get the adoption moved along?
So
I don't think that you can answer that. At least not. This is a completely different topic outside the work of this panel.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, one of the big fundamental problems in healthcare is that providers are paid for, providing a fixed fee for service regardless of outcome. And if you don't, technology at the end of the day is only an accelerator towards the things that you're incentivizing people to do. That's all it can do. It doesn't actually shift the incentives. If you don't shift those incentives, there is no technological solution to the incentives being in the wrong place.
yeah, I would defer that to the folks from the regulatory agencies. I can say, having spent a long time working on it, that especially in the U.S., but actually globally now, most of the governments are thinking very heavily about incentives, about how to actually realign them.
So I negotiated one more quick question from, he promised me, this gentleman, so great to have you. One quick, short question.
Quick question. I've been in healthcare for 40 years, and we talk about patients, but 80% of people are not really patients. They have really intermittent things, and it seems to me that digital health, for the 80% of people who spend very, very little in healthcare, are the exact target for all of this about personalized health, because it's all about the things that you can take care of. Do you get enough sleep? What's your diet? What's your exercise like? And all of those pieces of information are available now for people to work with. So the sense I have is that we will spend a lot of time on the 20% of people, but I think the digital health area for the 80% of people that really are not sick is really where we need to be focusing.
And that's why we think sports is such an important marketing platform for this, because you have athletes that are already in that position that are the epitome of health, are the ones that take care of themselves. And if they can get the message out there that, some of the things they do, sleep, nutrition, hydration, are preventative and improve their life, then I think that we've taken care of a better portion of those 80%.
We really appreciate the thoughts and expertise of this panel. Let's join together and thank them.